This is Join Us in France, episode 87. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise.
And today we are doing something very unusual. Changing things around a little bit. You see, this time I'm the one who prepared most of the topic we're going to talk about. And Elise is just along for the ride.
Oh, boy.
She's not very happy about it.
I'm not happy about this. I don't like riding in a boat when I don't know where the boat's going.
So I ambushed her this morning. Sorry. We were going to do something else, but yeah. Okay, so the topic of today's show is Louis the 14th. But
Louis the 13th.
See, that's the thing. Is it Louis the 13th or Louis the 14th? It's the beginning of the life of Louis.
This is like which comes
14th.
First, the chicken or the egg, you know?
Because when I was little, I read The Three Musketeers, and that's a classic book. And in this book, a lot of the subplot has to do with Anne of Austria and the fact that Richelieu, how would you say that in English?
Cardinal Richelieu.
Cardinal Richelieu did not trust her, at all. And there was a lot of intrigue. And so that got me reading about it. And, and I think it's just a fascinating thing. And so these are the things I found out that I think make for a fabulous story. So let me tell you a little bit about it and feel free to interject.
I will.
Okay. So when Louis XIV was born, they nicknamed him Louis Dieu donné, which means
gift of God.
Right, Louis the gift of God. Because his parents, who were Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, had been married for 23 years.
Can you imagine?
Before they had him. Right. He was born, so he being Louis XIV, was born on September 1638, and his parents had been unable to have children up until then. His mother, Anne of Austria, had 4 miscarriages in those 23 years, but no babies. That happened a lot. It still happens a lot today. It's a terrible thing. This was a worse hardship for them than it is for most people, because a king and a queen, their principal duty is to produce offspring.
A male heir.
A male heir. Because having a clear path of leadership in the kingdom is vital. Mm-hmm. If you don't have an heir, then the kingdom is unstable. It's everybody's the worse for it. I mean,
well, it's not just that it's unstable. It means that if the king who is in place doesn't have a direct male heir, a legitimate child, that means that his siblings and first cousins can also claim the throne.
Exactly.
And it leads to nice Shakespearean situations.
Exactly. And so then you have uncertainty, you have succession battles, you have murders, you have problems that go on for a month and years and whatever. So the birth of Louis XIV was huge news. The people of France, and at the time France had about 20 million inhabitants, more or less, they were very excited that the king finally had an heir, because that's how the system worked. The king had to have an heir. Louis XIII had finally discharged his duty, one of his most important duties, by having a child, and a male child too, as you pointed out, because in France it's only male royalty. Whatever.
And here I'm going to interject, because it is interesting to know that in the history of Western Europe, France is the only country of the unified countries, which would have been the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany, Spain, England, and France, and then eventually Holland. And France is the only country where there has never been a ruling queen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have issues. So when it takes that long to make a baby, of course, people talk, right? Because they say, well, was it really, we know who the mother is. That's pretty easy to establish. But was Louis XIII really the father?
Uh-oh.
Was Anne of Austria unfaithful to her husband, and that's why she got pregnant that time? Was this heir genuine or not? Okay, so those are the kind of questions that people had. Now, Anne of Austria, let's talk a little bit about her. She's 37 when Louis XIV is born. And like I said, the Three Musketeers goes into that.
Wasn't he the same age or a year older?
They were exactly the same age. Louis XIII were the same age. Yes. If you've read the Three Musketeers, you may remember, or if you've seen the movies, you may remember that Cardinal Richelieu and Anne of Austria had a terrible relationship. Well, first of all, Richelieu was not a friendly man. He was a very driven, intransigent type of person. His single focus was, one, to reinforce the power of the king, and two, enrich himself.
Exactly.
Yes. Which he did very well, by the way.
He did very well.
Mm-hmm. And so did his successor, what was his name?
The successor to Richelieu is the other one. Is the other one.
The other one, of course. Mazarin. Yes. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah.
Elise gets it. Okay. 1 point for Elise.
Right.
Okay. So he was wicked smart, Richelieu, and he stopped at nothing.
And ambitious.
Very ambitious. And he stopped at nothing to get his way. So he didn't trust Anne of Austria. And also, we have to say, Anne of Austria was not Austrian at all.
No.
Okay? She was the daughter of the King of Spain, Philip III. And at that time, France was at war against Spain. And that's what we call today the 30 Years' War. It was a long war, terrible war. Okay. Spain is thus the enemy of the Kingdom of France. And the Queen, is to have no contact with her family.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
That actually, it was the standard procedure. Mm-hmm. It was very hard because most of these people were married off at the very younger age. Mm-hmm. And
she was 14.
And they were then forbidden to have contact with their families because these were political marriages. And so they were afraid of them telling secrets.
Right. So Anne of Austria finds this very, very difficult because she's remained quite Spanish. Her French is only so-so. She prefers the ways of the Spanish court to that of the French court. And also, she got married to Louis XIII at age 14, and they were encouraged to consummate the marriage right away to produce an heir, presumably. But Louis XIII really wanted nothing to do with her. He was a weird guy. He ignored her for the most part, and she doesn't really understand why that is. She was expecting a husband, and she didn't get a husband. And they get off on the wrong foot.
Do you know what one of the rumors was?
What was the rumor?
He had what they call a mignon.
Oh, that he was homosexual.
Yeah.
Oh, he might have been. That's possible.
He had mignon.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the kings were basically what we could call, I'm not sure what right word to use, is omnivorous in the sense that they went either way.
Bisexual,
yeah. The idea was that if you were the king and you had the power, you could basically have literally whatever and whoever you want.
Yeah.
But there is some documentation that he probably was bisexual and that he did, among other things, have some mignon, which is a very cute word that they used for them.
So Anne of Austria was, on the other hand, she was very lively. She's very beautiful, very, very stunning. She likes to ride horses. She likes to stay busy. She likes to take chances, and she's just a lively kind of person. Louis XIII is more of the somber kind of person. He's uncomfortable around women. Was it because he was homosexual? Maybe. He even had a hunting lodge where no women were allowed to enter.
You see?
Not even servants or nothing like that. He was shy. He suffered depression. And he's very anxious. He's serious all the time. He's just a weird guy. And she intimidates the heck out of him. Okay? So what I've read was not that he was a homosexual, but that he was a soldier at heart. He was like one of those guys that has to be with the guys all the time, and he doesn't know what to do with a gorgeous woman. Who knows? But no matter what it was, Louis XIII and Anne of Austria were a bad match, and they didn't spend that much time in common. One thing they did have in common is that they were both very religious, very sincerely religious.
Very sincerely religious.
Yes.
Very sincerely, very, very devout Roman Catholics.
Yes. And she commissioned the construction of a convent, Val-de-Grâce is what it's called. And she goes on retreats to Val-de-Grâce very often. And while at one of those retreats, she's away from the clutches of Richelieu, and that's where she takes up a correspondence with her brother, who is the King of Spain by then, and with other people in Spain. But Richelieu finds out, because he has spies everywhere. Richelieu has her apartments searched for letters. They even looked to see in her bra to see if she wasn't hiding anything. She's very humiliated.
Corset.
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 Yeah, sorry.
Really? Not a bra. This is like Sofia Coppola's movie of Marie Antoinette. Just make a little anachronism. Yeah.
Yes.
Obviously.
It's a corset.
In the bones in the corset, right.
But, she's very humiliated, but she's also guilty as sin. I mean, honestly, she did have a correspondence with the enemy. So Richelieu has all sorts of incriminating evidence that shows that she was working with the enemy, and she's in a position where she has to admit to certain things just to hide other things. You know what I mean? Like, I'll tell him about this letter so he doesn't find out about that letter, kind of thing. Okay. But Anne of Austria is the kind of person who enjoys intrigue. She actually doesn't mind the conspiracy and the whole thing. She likes lively, she likes to stay busy. But she's now in the position where she's the queen, she's a traitor to the nation, and she has not produced an heir.
But is she really a traitor just by writing to her brother?
Well, I don't think from
she
today's
didn't really
perspective,
plot to overthrow the king.
No, but just the fact that she wrote to her brother was scandalous. So she wasn't really a traitor, but she did something that was against the rules, and she shouldn't have done it. Okay, so yeah, so she's considered to be a traitor, and on top of that, she hasn't produced an heir, right? So she's not in the good graces of much of anybody in France. And also, the other thing that doesn't help is that their sex life, Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, is really terrible. When she gets pregnant, she has a miscarriage. That makes them even more alienated from one another. That's what happens. And the pressure to have a baby is probably terrible. I can't imagine going through that.
Well, that's why Henry VIII wound up getting rid of so many wives, I mean, the whole problem with being a king is that in all of these countries all through Europe, and who knows about other parts of the world, you had to have a legitimate male heir. Every one of these kings had illegitimate children.
Yeah.
Every one of them. They had mistresses. This is not just in France, but they could not make that person, if it was a male child, into their king. So Henry VIII, for instance, who was a little bit earlier, in the 1500s, he got rid of his first wife, Catherine, who was also from Spain, after I think it was 25 years of marriage.
Wow.
Because they had one child, a woman named Mary, and he never had any surviving male children. And so he managed to divorce her or annul the marriage, even though they had a child, just because he needed to get somebody who would give him a male heir. So it becomes a big preoccupation.
Right. And also, Anne of Austria is not quite blameless in this whole affair because she's young and lively, and one day she was pregnant, and she's running around in the Louvre. They're having a party or some sort, and they had just set up a stand for some show, and she's running around, turns a corner, and there's this stand right there that she didn't know was there. She hits it so hard that she's knocked out cold, and she miscarries the baby.
Wow.
So, of course, that didn't ingratiate her towards her husband.
I just going to say, because you were saying about, she was a foreigner, that was a really common reaction in also a lot of the countries. They always had to have the king, or the king, the person who was going to be the king, they had to marry politically someone who was from another dynasty.
Yeah.
And very often,
to consolidate
they were
power.
very, very poorly received. They were considered to be the foreigner. I mean, this is really... Those were the women who, they were pawns, basically. They were given over for political reasons. They didn't have happy lives.
No, probably not.
They really
probably
didn't.
Not. And in this case, she miscarries this baby. He's cross with her all the time. And, of course, that makes them less likely to make another baby, obviously, So after this whole Letters to Spain episode, Richelieu, who is really the calculating type, he needs to decide what cards he's going to play. And is he going to push Louis XIII to repudiate his wife, or is he going to continue to push them to try and have an heir? What he's really worried about is that if Louis XIII dies without an heir, then the throne would go to Louis's brother,
Duc d'Orléans.
Gaston of Orléans.
Yes.
And Gaston of Orléans hates Richelieu with a passion.
And hates his brother. You have to know that.
I didn't know about that.
Oh, yes. Now, this is where I'll tell you the story, because it has to do here with Toulouse. The Duc d'Orléans absolutely hates his brother. Louis XIII, as you mentioned, is a devout Catholic. He's a fanatic, as a matter of fact. And he, and one of the things Anne of Austria did before they actually had their son, they went around France giving money to different places to create more monasteries and secret Catholic societies.
Oh.
They were very, very fanatical, traditional Roman Catholics. And the Duc d'Orléans plotted, he created a secret army, and he was planning on overthrowing his brother. Unfortunately for him, and this I think is I believe, the last of the stories that have to do with the Three Musketeers, he had spies that were sent by Richelieu in his entourage.
Oh, I'm not surprised. Richelieu spied on everybody.
He spied on everybody. And the Duc d'Orléans, one of the people he convinced to side with him was a duke from the south in this area, the Duc de Montmorency, who was a brilliant young military man who was really a duke. He was of royal blood. And he was the godson of Henry IV. Henry IV was Louis XIII's daddy.
Right.
This is one of those webs of intrigue, right?
Yes.
And what happened was, in 1632, the Duc d'Orléans created an army, and he attacked part of the army of his brother's army. But Richelieu knew ahead of time what was going to happen, and they got cornered, and the Duke of Montmorency was captured. Now, apparently, at that time, if you were a king's brother or a nephew, which meant you were royal blood, not just noble, you would be put into prison, but they wouldn't kill you.
Right.
You wouldn't kill somebody royal.
No.
But what happened was that Richelieu convinced Louis XIII that in order to stop any further rebellions on the part of his brother, couldn't kill his brother.
No.
But he could kill the people who had sided with him. And they decided to make an example of the Duke of Montmorency, even though he was royal. And so they condemned him to death. And so Louis XIII, his wife, Richelieu, and the entire court came down to Toulouse.
Right.
And right in the Henry IV courtyard, right where we have our beautiful city hall, Capitol, there's a plaque on the ground. That is where he was executed.
Wow.
And it was considered to be such a sin to execute royalty that even the Pope tried to intervene to stop the execution, because he was royal. He had blue blood.
Right. If you're royal,
you don't get killed.
God disapproves of that sort of business. Yeah.
So at the age of 32, he was executed. He was considered to be a good son of the Southwest, so they actually did what they sometimes did in those days. It's actually rather gruesome. They saved his heart. They embalmed his heart, which is buried in the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne.
Oh!
Actually, you won't get to see it, but it's actually there somewhere. It was considered to be a huge scandal in all of Western Europe.
Well, yeah, that sounds ridiculous.
Well, imagine all the brothers of other kings going, oops.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? It had the effect it was supposed to have. It was because Richelieu insisted that they did kill him, and it was the last rebellion of the brother, Duc d'Orléans, and there never was another one during
there you go.
Louis XIII's reign.
Yeah, they really had a problem with one another.
Well,
yeah,
they always wanted to fight for the throne.
Right. So Richelieu, he has to decide, who am I going to go with? If Louis XIII and Anne of Austria don't have an heir soon, there's no reason to believe he would like another woman any better. So if either I push them in that direction, or I risk the Duke of Orleans becoming the king. And so he decides, no, I'm going to push him to have a baby. And the king, the queen, Anne of Austria, she gets out pretty well out of this whole affair because, she was conniving, she has to write a confession letter, like some school child that was caught doing, where she says, oh, I won't do it again, kind of thing. But, and apparently some scholars say that Richelieu wrote the confession letter because it
made her sign.
Yeah, it was totally in her style. But it wasn't such a bad outcome for her because, she's been infertile. She was talking to the enemy. But as a person, she's really enjoying the kind of intrigue, the power. She has an exciting life. She can't go back to Spain, right? So she would rather try to have a baby than get sent off to some convent where she's going to be away from everything for the rest of her life. So she remains the Queen of France, and maybe she can influence the king sometimes in some things. Louis XIII, what did he decide? Well, he decided to go with Richelieu's plan. He decided that he was just going to, push forward, try to have a baby with Anne of Austria. So the baby did come, right? And I love the legend of how Louis XIV was conceived. Because, of course, there's stories about that, too. There's stories about everything having to do with these people.
Yes.
Yeah. So, legend has it that Louis XIV was conceived because of bad weather. The king went hunting, and he was supposed to sleep at a castle at Saint-Maur that night. And as you know, we've talked about it on the show a few times, the king of France at the time did not live in one place only. The king moved around. With the court. That was insurance against, murder and kidnappings and all of that kind of thing. So Louis XIII's bed that day was moved to Saint-Maur, but the weather got so bad while he was hunting that people said, it's too dangerous. You cannot go back to Saint-Maur. You have to sleep at the Louvre.
Where exactly is it, do you know?
I didn't look up where Saint-Maur was, but I think it's in the
Forest of Fontainebleau or something like that?
Yeah, it's a little further away than, because back then Paris, you could hunt in Paris.
Right.
I mean, they had woods
where
you could go hunting in Paris. So Le Louvre was closer, and so they said, you have to sleep at the Louvre. But there wasn't a bed fit for the king at the Louvre, because it had been moved to Saint-Maur, except for, of course, the queen's bed was fit for a king. And so the king decided he was going to share the bed with his wife, which was such a strange thing that the valets at the court were actually sent around to all the monasteries in Paris to ask them to pray for a miracle, that there would be an heir produced that night. And guess what?
There was. Now, do you know why it was considered so unusual for the king and queen to actually spend the night together?
Well, for the two of them anyway, it was because they didn't like one another. And so there was always something in the way.
But it was also interesting because you see that afterwards when you go to Versailles and you see the king's chambers and the queen's chambers.
Yeah.
In fact, they visited in the middle of the night.
Well, yeah.
And then they would go back to sleep in their own beds. It's very interesting.
Well, and they had very little privacy.
They had very little privacy.
So they had to, if they wanted privacy, they had to wait.
But what happened was apparently it was not considered normal for them to simply spend the entire night together. In other words, the king would go visit when he wanted to have sex with his wife.
Right.
And then he would go back to his own bed.
Yeah, I think that's because peasants were all huddled into a hut together.
It was considered to be lower class to sleep all together?
Yeah, I think that was a lower class thing.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I don't really know.
Interesting to know.
Yeah, but I think it's so funny to think of the monks being woken up at night, being told, pray so that the king and the queen will get it on,
and that it would be a baby that survives if it happens.
Right. So a few weeks later, it is announced that the queen is pregnant. The people of France are delighted. This being the court, the people are wondering, is this really and Louis XIII that made this baby or not? But there's a baby on the way. And in April, when she feels the baby move for the first time, they throw parties all over France.
Before it's even born.
Before it's even born. The Kingdom of France is still at war with Spain. And so this baby coming along is outstanding news because people are super religious. They believe in a God that literally moves the pawns on the chessboard, you know. Right. So if God granted them a pregnancy, it must be that God is with France, right? And so people totally believed in all of that stuff. And indeed, Louis XIV is born on September 4th, 1638. It was the custom back then for the queen to give birth with lots of people around. Yes. Yep. And the labor was very difficult. At one point, they thought she might die, but she didn't. I can't imagine why they thought all these people had to be...
I'll tell you why.
Oh, tell me why.
Because they had to have a certain number of witnesses to prove that the baby was truly the baby that came out of the queen's body.
Oh.
That is exactly why.
That's terrible.
Yep. Because since there was such a high mortality rate for newborns, right. There was always the fear that somebody would substitute a baby that wasn't truly the baby coming out of the queen's body.
Oh, wow.
That's why.
Oh, wow. So upon the birth and seeing that it's a male child, Louis XIII dispatches 50 carriers to go all over the land to tell of the good news. The cannon is fired, the bells of Notre Dame toll, you know, all of that. The king falls to his knees and praises God. But very strangely, witnesses say that he didn't kiss his wife or even pay any attention to his wife. He had to be prompted to go, you know...
Congratulate
her and, you know, kind of pretend like they were a couple or something.
Well, you know, I mean, it is true that he probably would have congratulated her by saying, Madame, you have brought us happiness, you know, something like that. I mean, I don't think they would have done some smooching in front of other people. You know. But, it was very formal, you know. I mean, of course, the stories of the French court are that beyond all the others, it was so formal. Everything was codified, you know. Right. But he was really a strange person.
Yeah, he was a strange person. And so everybody's happy with this because, I mean, Richelieu is super happy. There's a baby. And as a matter of fact, they will make another baby a year later or something like that.
I think it's just, about a year and a half.
Yeah, it wasn't much later. No. He had, so Louis XIV had a baby brother. Richelieu, of course, is happiest of all because he gets to stay in power and continue enriching himself. The only one who's not happy is the Duc d'Orléans because now he knows he's screwed. He's never going to be the king.
That's right.
You know, it's over. So the question of whether or not Louis XIII was the father. Well, you know, I'm not a historian. I haven't been digging into the original papers or whatever. But from what I read, it seems to me fairly likely that Louis XIII was the father. And the biggest reason why is that I know he didn't trust his wife at all. I know Richelieu spied on her constantly. I know she never had any privacy. So it would have been very difficult for her to take up an affair, or at least enough affairs to get pregnant 6 times altogether.
Yeah. The reality is that with all of these kings, they were allowed to go off and do whatever they wanted, but it was the queens who were not. Right. And they were really surveyed very carefully to make sure, because nobody wanted a bastard child becoming the heir to the throne.
Right. So that's one reason. But the other thing is he didn't trust her at all, yet he never worried. There's never any rumors or anything like that Louis XIII didn't think he was the father. So coming from a man who didn't love his wife or trust his wife, well, maybe he knew more than we do, you know.
Well, it was probably they probably knew enough in terms of keeping an eye on her that he was pretty sure that it was indeed his baby.
Right.
You know, I mean,
so they had their problems, but in the end they managed to produce an heir and an extra just in case. So the kingdom was very stable. Yeah.
Now, what's interesting to know is that I bet you don't know this. Richelieu was so wealthy that he had built for himself an incredible, absolutely magnificent palace along the Seine River. It is still there. It is the building that is now the Académie Française.
Oh, okay.
Which is absolutely magnificent. It's in the between the 6th and the 7th arrondissement, and it's this exquisite building in a semicircle with these magnificent pillars that is now the home to this. How would you describe the Académie Française? It's the institution for intellectual.
Yeah, they're the defenders of the French language, except that they defend it so much they're going to kill it.
Not just the French language, but they defend all of the intellectual heritage, I guess you could say, of France. It's a building that's absolutely exquisite, and he apparently at the time, except for the King's Palace, there was nothing bigger than this palace by Richelieu, which he managed to accumulate all kinds of artwork,
he was
statues.
Extremely wealthy.
He managed to really hold on to the power for as long as Louis XIII was alive.
Right. You know. So, Louis XIII dies when his son is 5 years old.
That's right.
And so Louis XIV becomes king in a way at age 5. But of course, there was a regency.
The regency.
Right. So what happens to a young French king? Well, he needs to be trained to be a king as a profession. So he learns to ride horses. They do strategy games. He plays with giant forts. But as it happens, he also learns some Latin and some French and some basic math. But he's not a great student, you know. He also learned Spanish with his mother, and Italian because he was a lover of the arts. So he could speak 3 languages, which is better than most people at the time. But it's really Mazarin, whose name you could remember earlier that I couldn't, who succeeded Richelieu as the prime minister and who was also a cardinal. They were both cardinals.
That's right.
Mazarin is really in charge of the kingdom. But in total, Louis XIV was king for 54 years.
The longest reigning king in France.
Right, in France. And that doesn't count the years where there was a regency.
No.
So, you know, he lived a long time. Now, Queen Elizabeth II of England has ruled longer by now.
She has just outdone her predecessor, Elizabeth I. And up until that time, it was Louis XIV and Elizabeth I.
Right. So, you know, that's a really long time for any king. So, especially when you consider life in France at the time. So now I want to bring it back to some of the gruesome realities of life in France at the time. So we understand, because this is all the setup to the French Revolution, right? This French Revolution is going to happen soon after,
150 years later.
Yeah. And there were a lot of circumstances that made it possible to happen. There are about 20 million French people, like I said at the beginning, but 15 million of them live as peasants in the countryside. Rural life for French people has not changed very much between the 900s and the 1600s. Poor peasants live in homes that are made of lumber and mud walls and straw roofs, nothing sturdy. But what modernity has brought is the ability to tax people, even the poorest people. So in 900s, the French king had it was very difficult for him to levy taxes because there were no roads, there was no administration, no civil servants. But by the time Louis XIV comes around, well, there are lots of roads, there's civil servants, there's lots of people who are quite willing to go beat up on the poor peasants to extract taxes out of them. And they pay taxes to the king, they pay taxes to the bishop of the Catholic Church. The local lords also tax the people, and so do the local priests. And then they have other taxes, like la gabelle, which was a salt tax, and many other taxes that, these poor people, they were lucky to have anything left at all.
It's not really accurate to say that there were no taxes earlier. It's just that the difference was that now you have a centralized country.
Right. So
that in the 900s, which is really after Charlemagne and all of that, you go into the feudal times. So basically what happened was the country was basically a lot of princedoms.
Yes.
And so the taxes existed, but they didn't go into a centralized place.
Right.
They didn't come up to Paris because they stayed locally in the feudal system.
Yes.
And then, of course, little by little, what happened was the kings in France started by marriages and other means, by war, annexing all of these areas.
Right.
And so, of course, yes, by the time you get to Henry III and then Henry IV, you have centralized power basically being in Paris with a few outlying areas. And then it really starts getting heavy on everybody.
Yes. You have many
Much
levels
more. Right.
of taxation,
Right.
and it's just impossible. People are really, really poor. The other thing that happens is that at the time, Europe was the temperatures were colder than average because of a phenomenon called the Little Ice Age. That went more or less from the 1300s to the 1850s. So that was a long, long time.
That's a long time.
Yeah. That means that harvests are really never a sure thing. There are famines. Those are a fact of life for poor people. You have people dying of hunger in France. It's very common. The king and the clergy, they don't really see poverty as their problem.
No.
Like, their responsibility is to keep people in line and keep them paying taxes. And the rest is like not their problem. The cold also killed a lot of people. And
the plagues.
Yeah, there were plagues. There was smallpox.
Yeah.
There was typhoid fever, which was very prevalent at the time. There were plagues, not too many anymore, but there were still some, and also France was very cold because French people were not quite as smart as the Italians when it comes to building homes. Because the homes that they built in Italy, the Romans, they had ducts underneath the house where they could run hot air or water under the house, which would keep the whole thing warmer. Well, French people, they just relied on one big, massive fireplace that was supposed to keep everything hot, but it doesn't. I mean,
That's why they started making tapestries to try and warm up the walls. Didn't work too well.
Yeah, even rich people in France were freezing.
They wore layers.
Yeah, it was very difficult for them to stay warm in the winter, especially.
Yep.
Food was very different. Now, the kings and nobility, they had access to nicer foods, but for regular people, for instance, peas were a luxury item. I don't know why, because peas are pretty easy to grow, but potatoes were very common in England and in Germany, but not so much in France. Oranges were...
And yet they were brought back from the colonies.
Yeah. They had them, but it wasn't...
They didn't use them, huh?
It was not as commonly grown as other things,
Interesting.
Oranges were a huge luxury reserved for the king. Tea, coffee, all of that. They were around, but they were really, really expensive. Sugar was unheard of.
Right. They used honey.
Yeah, it was really hard to get sugar at all. So mostly what people ate was they would have a big pot over the hearth and throw whatever they had in there,
And have nice hearty bread.
Yes, nice unleavened, pretty much,
right.
Rye bread.
And chunks of cheese.
Yeah, they made cheese and stuff like that. But there were a lot of malnourishment among the peasants. It was, even if they didn't die of starvation, people were pretty skinny and short and scrawny. And the average lifespan was 30 years old, which is really awful. Of course, they didn't have sewage systems, no toilets. So people did their business in the woods or in a bucket. The king was fancy. He had a chair with a hole in it. It was beautifully decorated, I'm sure.
Which, by the way, was walked around with him.
Oh, well, there you go. So he's going
even in Versailles.
Oh, goodness me.
Oh, yeah.
You're doing your business and there are people walking around you?
That's right.
Oh, no, that's not good. So then when you have a chamber pot, what do you do with the chamber pot? Well, they toss it out of the window and they warn people, they say, Gare à l'eau, which means watch out for the water, mind the water kind of thing. It was just nasty. People drank well water. In Paris, they drank straight out of the Seine.
Yep.
There were people who would just carry buckets back and forth, and you pay them.
Same in Toulouse.
Yeah, same in most cities. You know, there was no sanitation.
No, there was
whatsoever.
no notion of sanitation. Really.
No sewage, no sanitation.
Which is so strange because, of course, the Romans had it, but they lost it in the Middle Ages here. You know.
Yes, absolutely. The Romans totally showed them what to do.
You know,
but they didn't do it.
The oldest castles, the old fortified castles that were built between the 900s and the 1100s, the big stone ones that we still see in some movies, and there are still a few that are hanging out there. Baynac is a perfect example out in the Dordogne.
Yeah.
They actually had latrines built into the tower corners. And the latrines were stone seats, but they were latrines, you know.
Yeah, so there was some distance between
you. There was a distance, right? You'd sit on it. For some reason, after that, when they started making chateaux that are more like the kind we imagine today, they stopped doing it.
Which is weird.
They stopped. There were no more latrines in the chateau.
Well, if you think about the Romans, they had baths.
They had everything.
They had all of that. They
had everything.
Central heating, you know, with warm air. They had all this stuff.
But you realize what we're doing right now is we're reinforcing a stereotype from the old days of how the French were people who were not very, very clean and sanitary. But I think that legend comes from those times.
Yeah, and I don't know that it was just French. There was a famous French author, I can't remember, I didn't write down his name, so I can't remember it. But he taught that water was really bad for your skin. And so people didn't want to be submerged in water at all. At most, what they would do is take a washcloth, a wet washcloth, and wash like that.
Right.
That was the most you could talk them into. I mean, you know, that's really nasty.
It's nasty.
Yes, it's nasty. Doctors. Okay, they had doctors back
then,
right?
They bled you.
There you go. There you go. If you could afford a doctor, they mostly believed in bloodletting, purges, enemas. Louis XIV is said to have received at least 1,500 enemas in his lifetime.
Ew.
Yes. So they didn't believe in taking showers, you know, but washing out your colon several times a week, that was totally fine. Go ahead, do that.
Very strange, right?
It's crazy that they survived.
Well, you know, they say that it's apparently really, at least very partially true, that is one of the reasons that the perfume industry developed in France, because the court,
it was needed.
particularly once it got centralized, which is really starting with Louis XIII and then, of course, Louis XIV. Once you have a one-place court, there's no circulating around anymore.
Yeah.
The people did not wash, and they wore wigs, and they powdered their hair.
Right, because apparently typhus makes people's hair fall out, which I didn't realize.
Isn't that wonderful?
So even if you survive typhus, you're bald.
Oh, God.
And so that's another reason why they did a lot of wigs.
And they obviously knew about perfume. Perfume has existed since, you know, the Egyptians and the Babylonians, but at that time it was in oil form. But they started making a perfume with an alcohol base to use on their bodies to cover up all these odors in the court.
Yeah. Oh, just nasty.
It would be interesting to just for 5 minutes, not more, stand in one of these places to see what the smells were like.
We would run away.
I think we would
run
really
away.
run away.
It would be awful.
Bring a what do you call it? A clothespin with you.
Yeah. So the last thing I'm going to mention is that most French people were illiterate.
Yeah.
At the time, and we know that's because at the time, 86% of women and 70% of men could not sign their names on a marriage contract. So they did crosses or whatever.
Yeah.
There were some schools, but you had to pay to attend school, and it was never a priority. Even the children who went to school, they never went between April and late October because that was, you know, harvest and there was too much work in the field. So you might go to school November through March,
right,
but that was the most that you could get out of it. And also they were stupid because they would teach people Latin, very little French. So the curriculum was all weird.
But Annie, the reason they taught them Latin there were two reasons. One, they taught them Latin because it was important for them to understand what they were saying in church. Masses in church.
So everything was in Latin.
Masses in Latin.
Yeah.
And it's in Latin until the 20th century.
Yeah.
And of course the church is still a very big political power. But the other thing is that as rare as the idea of education was, it was based on the original concept of education, which came from a time when it was connected to Latin, to the church, to theology and philosophy. So they didn't, the idea of, you wouldn't teach in a vernacular. The vernacular was French.
Yeah.
You would teach it in the language that was the upper language.
But I mean, that's super complicated. The kid's going to be a peasant. For the love of Pete, don't try to teach Latin.
But, there were rich peasants. The landowning peasant class.
There were some,
So if they got a little learning and they knew how to read a little bit in church and sign their names, that was already considered to be a big deal.
Yeah. And typically at the time, it was the priest's helper that were the teachers, right? So they would also teach catechism.
And it was the monks who were often the teachers.
Right. So the Jesuits typically...
No, the Jesuits not until 1600s.
Right. But in the time of Louis the 14th, the Jesuits would go to people's, like the noblemen, the homes, and they were like a tutor,
That's right.
Tutoring.
They were the tutors,
But that was reserved to the noble.
Right,
the noble class, where they could afford to pay a Jesuit monk to come and teach their sons for the most part.
But it's always the same story. If you keep people uneducated, you keep them dominated.
Yeah. Oh, it's
really that.
So the contrast between Versailles, which probably was a smelly place.
It was a terribly smelly place.
Yeah. And regular life in France was so great. And there was, I think it didn't even occur to them to try and implement policies that would make things a little fairer. They didn't even see the need. I don't know how it is.
Some of them did.
Maybe.
There was actually a move by what I guess we could call the equivalent of a middle class. Mm-hmm. Basically, they had a certain influence, and they would have representatives that would go to the court, starting with Louis XIV. But of course, by the time you get to his great grandson, Louis XVI, what happens is they start warning the king and the court that there's rumbling going on, and that there are things sort of boiling up. Mm-hmm. And what happens is that basically the court doesn't pay attention. They don't think it's serious enough. But it's the upper middle class, educated people, not the nobles, who are saying, look, we don't even want to lose our privileges because we are wealthy even if we're not noble. So if the bottom is going to start boiling up, this is all going to explode. Something has to be done.
Yeah.
And what happens is there are these warnings, and the warnings probably, if I understand correctly, really go on for about 80 years. But nobody really believes that this is going to explode the way it explodes.
Yeah.
It's basically being very blind. And of course, by the time you get to Louis XV and Louis XVI, it's out of their hands. It's gone beyond being able to control.
Yeah, by then the Enlightenment has happened. People are much more literate, and there is no turning back.
There's no turning back.
No. They couldn't put up with this sort of life because people lived really a very religiously, like they had religious blinders on. They didn't even see their predicament because to them, all that mattered is that the priest told them that they would go to heaven.
That's right.
That's where real life was. It was heaven. This one was just suffering. It was nothing but awful. So you had to stay as good as you could today so you could go to heaven. It's just a really different mentality than what we have today. So,
and it's also why it makes me think. I was just doing a visit the other day with 3 Americans and a woman from Australia, and I was saying it's something that it's sometimes hard for people to realize today, that the church was also a political power, and people were more afraid of the church and the church's influence than they were practically of the king.
Right.
And the revolution was really against both of them.
Oh, yeah.
Not just against the king.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Because, the priest could damn you to hell.
They could damn you to hell.
And that was, bad.
They damned you to hell, and they taxed you, too.
Yeah. No. So that's what I had prepared for today. So I just thought it was really interesting. That bit really interested me, and you played along very nicely. Thank you.
Yeah, and can I just add a couple of things?
Of course.
Louis XIII was the person really responsible for the idea of creating a huge chateau at Versailles. And of course, it's his son, Louis XIV, who eventually, in his incredibly long reign, makes it into the magnificent thing you see today, mostly. But when you were talking about hunting lodges, Louis XIII was actually a fanatic hunter.
Yes.
And one of the places he hunted was this lodge he had in this valley in the area of what is now Versailles. And he decided, because he liked it there so much, that he wanted to turn it into a small chateau so that he could use it for things other than just going hunting. And so it was already a little bit of a chateau, a nice central part of it, with a little bit of a chapel, because the king always had to have his nice little chapel, especially Louis XIII.
They went to mass every day.
Every single morning.
Every day, yeah.
Every single morning. And then when Louis XIV stopped being the baby regent by his mother and Richelieu, and then, of course, he took Mazarin on. Then he decided, after having lived for a while in Le Louvre and in Fontainebleau and these other places, he decided that he really liked Versailles best of all, and that it would be very, very astute politically to make everybody come to him. And that's how he decided to turn Versailles into what it is today.
Wow.
But it was really his father who started it.
And obviously we've done an episode about visiting Versailles. It was one of the early ones. Maybe it was episode number 14 or something
in the beginning.
Like that. Yeah, it was in the beginning. But the whole story of Versailles, I was reading the other day about how the swamps, Versailles was very swampy. So we'll probably do another episode on how the castle was developed at some point. I would like to.
And interestingly, because it has to do with technology that was brand new for the time. So it was a major, major thing. It wasn't just politically. I mean, engineering wise, it was an incredible event too, you know. But, and Louis XIII, I guess it's interesting because I imagine him coming to Toulouse on his horse with Anne of Austria next to him and Richelieu, and they are the bad guys, and everybody sort of wanting to hiss them, but they're afraid of them, you know. So,
no, it must have been quite the thing because that's a long way.
That's a long way.
I mean, even today, Toulouse, if you're going to drive, it's going to be 8 hours drive or an hour and a half flight.
I guess they stayed in chateaus along the way, but
must have taken several days. Can't have been.
It would be interesting to find out how long it would have taken.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's our podcast for today. Thank you.
The birth of Louis XIV.
The birth of Louis XIV and how it came about. I couldn't believe that Anne of Austria actually got into that much trouble for writing letters.
Well, queens were never trusted very much.
That's probably what it is, actually, because that's just crazy. She was when I think of a queen, I think of a powerful person who can just say,
but that's because
stand on your head and you have to do it.
That's Elizabeth I. That's what, they say that's why Elizabeth I never married. Because she refused the idea that if she got married, it would mean that the man would be in charge no matter who he was. And she did not want to have anybody in charge except for her.
Well, and maybe she also had,
She had lovers. She had
men lovers?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
she did.
No, she just didn't want to marry any of them. No, she was good. Yeah, go home, dude. Go.
She was going to be the CEO no matter what. Poor Anne of Austria. I mean, I have no idea whether she was really a nice person or not, but the truth is that all of these women who got married off to kings, they were simply pawns in the power game,
And this whole business of the pressure of making babies.
Oh, yeah.
And it didn't work, and medicine was not there.
Oh, no. And the women even didn't matter if you were queen or not. You could die in childbirth too, So at least she produced her lineage. She
did do that. And France was certain that it was an act of God, Dieudonné. Isn't that a good name?
Yep.
If I was young enough to have babies, I would put Dieudonné.
Oh, no. Don't believe you. Not for a second.
I wouldn't. No way. All right. Well, thank you very much, Elise.
You're welcome.
And we will talk to you next week.
Next time.
Au revoir.
Bye.
This brings us to the end of another Join Us in France travel podcast. You can leave a comment on the website, follow us on Facebook, or look for @ParisPodcast on Twitter. I put lots of information on Facebook and Twitter that never makes it into the shows. And also, this is a subliminal message. Join the mailing list. Now, today. You can do that on joinusinfriends.com. Look for the green button. Et c'est tout pour aujourd'hui.